The streets are crowded, the streets are mad, a virus is reckoning across this land. We cannot mask the hate, the truth we face. Symbols must go on, we gotta heal the pain, a daily challenge as we face. I look at the sky, and what do I see? The sunset is down upon me. Will I rise? Will I see another sunrise? Will that freedom come up to me?
Breath for me to breathe. I can't believe I'm about to retreat and kiss this all behind. Breath for me to breathe. I can't believe I'm about to retreat and kiss this all behind.
Okay, hi, welcome. As we're gathering, please respond to a prompt that we just put into the chat. I think it's the question like, what does wealth mean to you? Also, you may want to grab a pen and a paper because we're going to use some economic vocabulary and talk about history. And you may want to keep track of the questions or ideas that come to your mind. Also, if you're able, please rename yourself to include the city you live in. We will be recording this event to post on our website, but before we post the video, we will remove the sections where people are speaking and sharing. But we encourage you to please put your view on the gallery mode, which you can select by clicking on the word view in the top right corner of your screen. In that menu, you can select gallery. So if you're doing that, again, there's a prompt in the chat asking what comes to mind when you hear the word wealth. So I wanted to do a brief introduction for who we are. First and foremost, we are the Focolare movement. And as a movement, our goal is unity, loving the other as Jesus loved. And one of the ways we achieve it is through dialogue. We dialogue with other faiths, we dialogue with other cultures, and we dialogue with different groups. And with courageous conversations, we dialogue about race. It's almost 5 years since the murder of George Floyd and the civil unrest that followed afterwards, which fueled even more our passion for unity, justice, and equity for all people, but in regards to African Americans in this country in particular. So a group of us came together to see how we as a movement can respond to the call of action of racial equity and justice. We started having a number of small conversations that eventually grew into larger conversations about theme subjects, which many of you have participated in. And we're grateful that you keep returning to keep the conversation going. We learn something every time we gather, and we hope that our open dialogue is strengthening the relationships among us. So in this past October, we had an 1 hour session to consider the ways that we experience privilege. We discussed privileges in many kinds, including race, body size, wealth, citizenship, mental status, age, formal education, gender, and many other aspects of our lives and identities. In particular, we spent some time discussing our ordinary privileges, which was a new vocabulary word for many of us. Here is the definition of ordinary privilege: the ability to forget about aspects of who you are because they represent the majority demographics of your country, organization, school, neighborhood. And examples include things like being able to access a building without needing to search for an accessible entrance, being able to speak freely about your sexual orientation without fear of workplace discrimination, or being able to walk through a city without experiencing heightened scrutiny from law enforcement based on one's race. So just to refresh our memories or set a foundation for people who weren't able to attend the meeting last October, we have a few quotes from attendees. So privilege can change with context. A few people thought their non-privilege, like for example, not speaking English as a first language, being a person of color, being short or elderly, turned into a sort of privilege in a particular context. Remedying privilege helps everyone. Speaking up as an advocate is not just in the interest of the person who was injured, it's in everyone's best interest for injuries to be remedied. Life in the majority. Several people noted that in the spaces and places of their lives, they were mostly in the majority. And needing to prove oneself. A participant noted that because of people's prejudice, she and her family always felt they had to prove themselves, prove that they belong. So today we're continuing the conversation on privilege, but we're going to talk specifically about wealth privilege. We hope to address three things. What does racial wealth gap mean? What caused this gap? And what does this mean for us as people who live in the spirituality of communion? So I'm going to turn this over to Vivette and Julie as we start with defining the term racial wealth gap.
Hello, my name is Vivette Catapon. I'm from Northern California, and I'm a volunteer, and I feel fortunate to be part of this Racial Equity Courageous Conversation group.
And I'm Julie. I'm from Boston. And in the same way that in the last conversation, we had to define at the beginning what privilege meant, we thought it would be good to take a moment in this one to define what wealth means. I appreciated all the things people wrote. I think it's it's one of those words, loaded word, right? That we can all have a different sense and assumption behind it. So here's a big slide with some definitions. You have, I think the first thing that's to say that isn't really on here is that income and wealth are not the same thing. Income is just the wages you earn at your job. It can lead to wealth if you make enough of it and are able to save it rather than spend it, but it is not the same as what we mean when we say wealth. Wealth is more significant than income in terms of providing economic security and opportunities to fully participate in society. So wealth is, as you see here, the sum of assets minus all your debts. And there's a list here of things that we call assets.
Okay, some of the assets include bank account value, home value, value of CD and money market accounts, stocks, bonds, treasury bills, the current redeemable value of retirement savings, anticipated Social Security and life insurance policies. Another one is farm and or business value. And debts include things like credit card debt, educational debt, medical debt, and home mortgage.
So this slide just gives you a sense of what proportions of wealth fall into certain subcategories. It, just to be really clear, shows average breakdowns for households in the United States. And when generally it's good to think when you hear the word average, it means you are not represented here, right? Because average person doesn't exist. It's a sum of lots of people, billions, and taking the percent, averaging it out. So your wealth, for example, might be if 15% of home equity would not be true for someone who lives in Boston. Most people in Boston have all their wealth in their home equity because we have a very expensive housing market. So you can just, see how you settle into this. But an important thing to notice when you're thinking about household wealth is that on average, about 10% of households in the United States have no wealth at all, or negative wealth, meaning their debts exceed the value of their assets.
Also, I think sometimes people don't think that Social Security benefits at retirement as wealth. Social Security gets referred to as an entitlement when we talk about it in the federal budget, right? But it's about 20% of a typical person's wealth. It is a good example of ordinary privilege. If you're going to receive Social Security benefits, you're probably not thinking about the daily expenses and how to create this monthly income after you can't work anymore. But if you know you will not be receiving Social Security when you retire, you're very aware of the particular uncertainty that this creates for you. So these statistics are from 2022. They come from the Federal Reserve. The black bars above and below indicate the margin of error. As you can see, the median wealth is much lower for the Black families, just $44,900, rather than the $285,000 for white families.
So this is when I out myself as a math teacher. Say just to notice that we use the median measure here, which means the very middle of all the data points. We do that rather than averaging because averaging actually shows an even greater disparity between the wealthy families and the poorer families because there are some big outliers on the upper end of that. And so in order to feel like we have a more accurate measure, I guess a conservative measure of the disparity, we use median for this. It might be a moment while you're looking at that to think about where you fit in the data, right? That you think about people who fit into this data and where they are. If you're white, thinking back to that previous slide, you can think about whether your Social Security benefits, your home equity, your pension, or your retirement, do they add up to roughly $285,000? Just give you a second to think about. And as you see on the slide, right, just in summary, Black households have about $16 of wealth for every $100 of wealth in white households.
Okay, this data from the US Census indicates that 1 in 5 Black households have no wealth or negative wealth. You can find very similar data reflected in other surveys by the Pew Research Foundation or the Congressional Budget Office or the Federal Reserve. It's fairly straightforward to demonstrate that the transfer of resources across generations is a major factor in individual or family's level of wealth. Many analyses say it's the most significant factor. When 21% of the Black households have zero or negative wealth, they are not able to transfer resources across generations. And in fact, younger generations are often helping to bear the debt burdens for older family members.
So, conversations about race are challenging. It can be polarizing to start pointing out or emphasizing differences. It's also easy to start asking questions about context and tempting to want to explore individual or particular situations. We could, of course, talk about various wealth gaps between genders, ages, and other types of households. But we want to focus specifically on the gap between races. And as you can see, we've honed in on this gap between whites and blacks. As you have seen, the disparity is extreme when we isolate race as the criteria for comparison. So now that we've seen the disparity, let's ask ourselves, is it a problem? If we think it is a problem, why do we think so? We'd like to have an open discussion here and want to frame this conversation by saying it can feel scary to share your ideas. I would guess that each of us might even have a different sense of what the question means. This is a moment for us to listen to others without judgment, in order to try to understand the other's point of view and hear people's questions without really trying to answer them. So we're going to take about 5 minutes to hear people's first ideas. So please raise your virtual hand or wave at us on the screen and we'll call on people. One way to share would be to say what you've noticed and what you wonder, including noticing how you're feeling about this topic. So we're going to remove the slide sharing and we want to start, and we want to remind you as well, put yourself in gallery mode so we can see everyone. You can see everyone. And we're going to open up the floor. So if anybody wants to give a comment or a thought, just put your hand up under reaction, under react. I think you can put your hand up. Or you could put something in the chat if you'd rather do that. Any thoughts about what Julie and Vivette have just presented about the definition of race? I'm sorry, definition of wealth. Daniel.
Hi, good afternoon. I think that I don't know if you're going to talk to this later or not, but I believe that the wealth inequality is also one of the drivers for tensions among people.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that when people see that there is inequality, that can drive resentment and create the circumstances for it to be even more generational and propagated. And so that's why if we don't do anything about it, it's problematic for everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Can
Anything?
I ask Ina I'm not 100% sure what your comment meant about, are you just noticing that the gaps are affecting people in a negative way, Joaquina? I'm sorry to, you don't have to speak out loud if you don't want to, but I see your question and I'm not sure that I understood it.
Well, I think I saw a question about gaps matter. And sorry, I was not paying too much attention because I have somebody here living and everything in my background. That's what you didn't see me either. She's gone. Anyway, Well, that's what I understood. Sorara said if those gaps are affecting people in a negative way, of course, this matter to me. I mean, I don't know, but if I answer the right way, but I'm sorry. Now I'm 100% here. I was not, but thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay, we can take another comment if there is one.
Yeah, I don't think my camera's working, but I could make a comment. So, living in New York City, very often it's extremely obvious the actual differences. I used to travel a lot more for work. So I would drive through certain neighborhoods in New York, and you would see the difference from the neighborhood that I live in and some of these other places, for example, East New York. That it looked terrible. The actual architecture, the way things look in the streets, really did not look like a place I would want to park my car and go out for a walk. So there are very obvious physical and financial differences between certain neighborhoods in New York. Um, we've moved to another area, but we used to use the L train, and the L train would go from Canarsie all the way through East New York and then through various other neighborhoods until it went to Manhattan. But sometimes, depending on the time of the day, you would feel uncomfortable in the train carriage because of the other passengers with you. They may have been making a racket, or they may have seemed threatening, or whatever. But now we're closer to Park Slope. Park Slope is we don't live in Park Slope, but it's a very wealthy area, with lots of families, pushing strollers. People typically, if they don't need anything, shoes, books, whatever, they leave it on the porch, or they leave it by the sidewalk, and people just come and help themselves, leave it out there for free. So it's a very different vibe. And obviously the people who live in Park Slope are of a higher median income, So that's just one very obvious physical, visual difference of a wealth gap here in New York City.
I received a message from Carol Nakai. Go ahead and please unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I was looking at the statistics. I think my mom belongs to the 6.6 Asian that doesn't have um savings. She's been relying on Social Security, Medicare, and we have a version of Medicaid here in California. We're from San Francisco, and so she's, you know, she's currently being supported by Medi-Cal. I actually had to choose to move in with her in 2022 to take care of her when she was not anymore in full capacity to take care of herself. And until recently, she had to go to nursing home because I also could not take care of her, and I had to go back to work because I'm no longer allowed to work from home. So thankfully, we're able to juggle, the cost to support her. But right now, she is fully relying on Medi-Cal to support her nursing care. And personally, I feel guilty about that because of pride, and the joy of taking care of her full time. But physically, I'm not able to anymore take care of her because of the kind of care she needs.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Carol. And
Thank you.
thank you for everyone that shared. I want to hang on to what Daniel said about the racial gap leading to tensions among different people, right? And how it gets passed on. I myself have seen that in the Bay Area, in the Oakland area, and also piggybacking on the other speaker and how you know, just the neighborhoods are structured, that it also intensifies the tension between peoples. But it, you know, one of the biggest factor is really the racial wealth gap. So thank you for your reflections. Okay, so the spirituality of the Focolare reminds us that behind all these statistics are people like Carol's mom, right? Each person behind the one in Black households with no wealth or negative wealth has a story. Just like Carol's mom also has a story, right? Sometimes it's important to hear each individual story.
So this slide is one answer to, does a racial wealth gap matter? It comes from Catholic social teaching. This principle at the top, one of the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, is that we always want to try to uphold and promote the life and dignity of the human person. Let's remember that we're not using the word wealth to indicate rich folks. Economically speaking, wealth is much closer to meaning that you have a cushion of security when unexpected things arise. So people with less wealth experience the difficulty of meeting basic needs, access to housing, food, healthcare, education. People with less wealth experience difficulty and inability to manage financial shocks like job loss, unexpected medical expenses, a major repair of some kind, economic downturns. People with less wealth experience financial worries and struggles, and that can cause significant stress and anxiety, which impacts mental and physical well-being. People with less wealth have limited access to leisure activities, travel, and other experiences that enrich our lives. And people with less wealth experience an inability to self-determine, to plan long-term goals like retirement or education. So in short, wealth allows people to live with less anxiety. The ordinary privilege for someone who has some wealth is that you wouldn't even be aware of the things that you're able to manage, since your wealth allows you to handle those things by shifting your resources. For example, that time I couldn't make my car payment, I was able to borrow from someone I knew and pay them back, so the missed payment wouldn't affect my credit score. Or those months I had to go without work because I was laid off, I was able to collect unemployment because I qualified for it based on the nature of my job and the nature in which I lost it. Those are ordinary privileges, right? Things that I would need to make myself aware that other people don't have them. My situation might have been bad, but I had a way of figuring out a solution with people or things a different person might simply not have access to. So keep reminding yourself, we're not talking about your take-home pay. Do you have any home equity at all? Do you have some savings? Do you have retirement funds coming to you via Social Security, a pension, investments? Do you have a trusted friend or family member who you could call who has more financial security? That's what we mean by wealth. There are also folks in this Zoom, many of us, who are part of an extraordinary global communion of goods that allows us a different kind of fiscal stability, a different cushion of security if a medical expense comes, or if you need to travel to see a family member who is ill. In short, wealth allows people to have a different measure of self-determination, a different measure of dignity.
Okay, so let's keep in mind that the extreme gap we see between races is felt by many Black people as a gap that exists because of racism. There is a very real emotional component to the racial wealth gap. None of us want to feel like a statistic. We want to be thought of as people, as neighbors to one another. But of course, the gap is real. And if, in fact, whole groups of people are being negatively affected by the gap, it makes sense to be curious about how it happened. Right? So that's what we're going to do after a short bio break. And when we come back, we'll run through some of the patterns and systems that contributed to building the racial wealth gap. Bio break time.
1:32, maybe we come back at 1:37. Does that work?
Okay. So welcome back, everyone, and buckle up, because we're going to speed race through some American history to paint a picture of the landmark moments that created this ever-widening wealth gap. And we're going to focus on the wealth that comes from acquiring land, since home equity is not only one of the components of wealth, but it also leads to other components of wealth. So we're going to invite Vivette and Julie back to give you a bit of history.
Thank you, Angelica. So here are some dates that begin with the 246 years during which Africans were enslaved by law in the colonies, and then in the place that became the United States in 1776. So in 1865, the promise of 40 acres and a mule is offered as reparation via Special Field Orders number 15, as you can see in the photo. Then a few months later, though, President Andrew Johnson returned the 40 acres land to the former Confederate owners.
And here you have a slide that tells you Black land ownership was slowly growing despite a lot of barriers from Black codes, which is a series of laws, and Jim Crow laws, another group of laws, until about 1910. So those Black codes and Jim Crow laws caused these bullet points underneath. So just and general racism, right? Prejudice. So destruction of property in Black communities. Black landowners were being forced off their land through intimidation and violence. 4,000 or more lynchings between 1860 and 1940. White speculators and local officials used legal loopholes to seize land that Blacks owned legally. The U.S. Department of Agriculture frequently denied Black farmers loans and assistance that white farmers received. So in about after 1910, you see Black land ownership declining consistently for those reasons. And I think it's just important to point out that the Black codes and the laws are there. It's legally sanctioned, right? This is part of our legal structure at this point in the history of the country. So many of the key welfare programs of the 20th century initially excluded Black Americans, either explicitly or just through structural design. For example, the Social Security Act of 1935 excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which were jobs disproportionately held by Black people at the time. So it wasn't explicitly saying that Black people can't participate, but it only gave participatory right to people who didn't have these jobs that were more held by Black people than white people. Another example of just legislation that became explicitly racist was the 1937 Housing Authority. It was created to build public housing. And then just to give you an example, there's many examples, but in Austin, Texas, they implemented this by moving all the Black families in that city to a single neighborhood where they had been dispersed and more integrated into the community before that. And then relocated the Black school, because remember, schools would have been still segregated at this time in history, Black theater. So some of the amenities to the Black community just all were moved to that neighborhood. And so it became sort of ghettoized location where people were required to live if they were living in public housing, which was a gift during the Depression and right afterward, which is when this is happening. So the Los Angeles did a similar thing. So I know some people are joining from there. And then when it became this slum and was underserved because of that, they just tore it down and put a highway right through it. Sorry, go ahead, Vivette.
That's okay. So this slide shows historic exclusion from benefits. In 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, was created as part of the New Deal to help struggling homeowners refinance their mortgages and not lose their homes. The HOLC created residential security maps, the maps which would later be used to legally enforce redlining. The Federal Housing Authority, FHA, used these maps to deny loans in areas deemed unsafe or risky. So we will now watch a 4.5-minute video to show you that a brief overview of redlining.
In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. So I want to talk about redlining because this is a term you may have heard, but most people don't actually know the history. In 1933, in the midst of America's Great Depression, when unemployment rates were 25% and millions of people were not only out of work, but many of them were houseless, the federal government, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, established an agency called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. Basically, it tried to make home buying much more affordable by subsidizing the cost of building and lending such that people would be able to afford to buy for the first time. Millions of Americans participated, except that when the Home Owners Loan Corporation began to issue mortgages, it came up with a scheme to decide which communities were deserving of loans and which ones weren't. They made maps and used a color-coded scheme. Green meant this was a community that you could lend to, and red meant you could not. The basic decision they made was to determine that any community with the presence of Black people or brown people or people who perhaps spoke Italian in certain parts of the country could not receive support from the Home Owners Loan Corporation. This created a system that came to be known as redlining, because communities that were deemed risky by the mere presence of people of color, most especially Black people, were disqualified from getting direct support from the federal government to purchase homes. This policy lasted until 1968, when the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, which made all forms of discrimination in the buying and selling or renting of homes illegal. But the truth is that the legacies of redlining from that moment to the present meant that Black people were subjected to other forms of exploitative lending. A system called contract buying grew up as a way to sell Black people homes on a layaway plan. You made set payments over an extended period of time, but you never owned the home until the very last payment. It was very common for unscrupulous sellers to withhold that final payment in an effort to take back the home from a person who had worked incredibly hard to buy it. Home ownership has been the most important asset that a typical white family has in order to do simple things like borrow money to send a child to college. But most importantly, they have financial freedom. But for communities that have been subjected to redlining, they didn't have those advantages. Not only that, the very communities that they lived in suffered from divestment, including the lack of grocery stores, the lack of businesses, the imposition of federal highways that often bisected their communities. In every way imaginable, the consequences of redlining to many Black and brown communities across America meant that those communities had the least and the last of everything. And to this day, the median wages and income of those communities and the financial insecurity that people who live in redlined communities face has long-term health consequences for families, has educational consequences for young people whose schools often don't have the tax basis to give them the same resources that communities that were never redlined actually have.
Paul's getting to the next slide. I will say that one of the things this speaker kind of misspeaks about in this presentation, he talks about the homeowners loan corporation making loans to people. It's government ease, but I'll just in case you actually know the history and are wondering why he said that. The homeowners loan corporation was about refinancing mortgages that were underwater because of the Great Depression and people losing their homes. So they helped people refinance and actually did that in a much more equitable way. But then they drew these maps. And so those redlining maps became the underlying justification for the other governmental loans to be not issued to people who lived in redlining districts. So the homeowners loan corporation themselves was not the issuer of mortgages, of new mortgages. Okay, so this slide is very obvious what it's about. Segregation doesn't build unity. And so one obvious effect of redlining is especially important to us who want to build a united world is that it segregates people. It segregated people. And in fact, it pitted people against one another. Someone mentioned this actually in our last session about the kind of this myth that arises around poor people lacking moral character and lacking initiative. When we were talking about privilege, they mentioned it. So this, in fact, is partly a result of redlining. So the narrative of realtors, the pictures, in case you can't tell from this, is of homes that were, the top ones are people committing violence against Black people who sort of dared to try to live in a white neighborhood. And the bottom slide is of the freeway that got rid of the federal housing assistance program that was for the Black communities in Los Angeles. So that the narrative, though, of realtors especially trying to like just help people decide where they should live, was that the condition of the Black neighborhoods were proof of the immorality and lack of initiative of the people who lived there. So it kind of misdescribed, I guess, the cause-effect consequences, so saying that the people caused the conditions rather than the conditions caused the problem for the people. Housing segregation also sanctioned the kind of violence you see in these pictures. So if a Black family, for example, dared to buy a home in a white neighborhood, they would experience this kind of violence, or rent a home in a Black neighborhood. And then a common follow-up was that the attorneys would sue the person who rented the home to them and the Black family themselves, saying that their move into the neighborhood is what incited the violence. And so it was therefore their fault. And so people sued the family for even daring to move in. Just maybe one last thing is that obviously this is Los Angeles. I think that picture is of a house in a suburban Chicago. And, just to emphasize, this isn't just happening, in Mississippi or Alabama, places where you maybe knew that people would burn crosses on lawns and throw rocks through windows or burn down entire homes. This is happening all over the United States.
So once the redlining practice was in place, it affected all kinds of other things. Other long-term effects of redlining include lack of grocery stores in redline neighborhoods, imposition of highways through redline communities, eminent domain, loss of businesses, lack of business loans in redline communities, loss of tax base to fund education, overcrowded, overpriced housing led to the growing slum conditions, lack of accessible health care. Today, the median wages remain suppressed in redline neighborhoods. So here's the last date, 1944. You've almost made it through the history. So the last long-term effect that we're going to talk about of redlining is the GI Bill of 1944. The GI Bill benefits were offered to all qualified veterans, but administration at the local level meant that Black veterans often faced discrimination, making it harder for them to access education benefits because of the discrimination in admissions, or VA-backed home loans because of redlining.
In 1968, we have the Fair Housing Act. It's passed. It prohibits discrimination regarding the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. It was an acknowledgement of the harm that had been caused by the federal housing policies. So these legally sanctioned exclusions from 1965, the end of the Civil War, until 1968, when this law was passed, had a long-term compounding effect on the prevention of wealth accumulation for Black families. So in 1968, about 64% of white families and 38% of Black families in the US owned property. Wealth estimates suggests, I think it was said on a previous slide, that about 2/3 of a typical American's household wealth comes from home ownership. And again, that's because the equity is often used for things like borrowing for education, which leads to access to a higher income job with long-term benefits like retirement or savings or access to healthcare, and certainly access to Social Security. And those things allow for that generational transfer of wealth across the generations.
So as always, when we learn a new thing or look at something with new eyes, it's a good idea to pause and try to see what it means for us. If I can add a few comments myself, because we gave a lot of statistics and we gave a lot of history about what happened, but then we're also mentioning that it continues on and is still felt today. I myself personally, when I think John had mentioned the neighborhood we used to live in, Canarsie, at one point, the demographics were particularly all white. And this is maybe their late 80s, early 90s, when Black families did try to buy a home in a neighborhood, there were times where it was burned to the ground or they were sued. So it's not something that happened 50, 60 years ago. But, in the recent past, in my recent lifetime, I've seen it happen. And also mentioning, the economic disparities in certain neighborhoods. I see this to this day. I've been in some of these neighborhoods that even John mentioned, East New York, here in New York, where you don't see grocery stores, and you don't see, the privileges that other neighborhoods get. That mentioned one called Park Slope was very economically sound, and you see not only that, but different economies growing, where in other neighborhoods to this day you don't see it. So everyone on this call has one premise in common, to desire to live in a way that contributes to building unity by loving Jesus with one another. We've essentially defined what a wealth gap is and presented some historical data on policies and practice that created a gap, and it continues to this day. So what do you notice about how you feel? What do you notice about your position in that data? If you weren't born or raised in the United States, are you wondering whether a similar gap exists in the country where you grew up? If you were born and raised in the US, are you wondering about anything that relates to your own story? Are you surprised by all this information, or are you skeptical of it? So we're going to take another 5 or 10 minutes to hear from one another. And then we're going to move into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes to, get more information. And then we're going to close out. So we're opening the floor. If you could put yourselves back into gallery mode. And we'll open up ourselves for any more comments about what you heard, what you thought about. I see Larry's raised his hand, so.
I just wanted to comment about Los Angeles, because there was an event there that it wasn't specific to the Black community, but it was specific to the Mexican Americans there. In 1957, there's an area there called Chavez Ravine, where a lot of the Mexican American families were living. And they were redlined through eminent domain. They were forced out to leave that area, and that area was then given to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they moved to LA, and which is now the site for the LA Dodger Stadium.
Oh.
And to this day, there's that you know, bad feelings about being pushed out by the housing authority. The second thing I want to mention is that when you ask, does racial equality matter? I wanted to find out, I asked myself, when does it not matter? Right? Obviously, there are absolute moments in time where it doesn't matter. When we're born or when we die, it doesn't matter. During you know, disaster, during moments of their rapid response, you know, that racial or wealth inequality doesn't matter. But also during times of worship, when we're in church, we feel like we're you know, the class doesn't matter because we're thinking of a higher level. But as soon as we step out of the church, you immediately see the difference. And so I think of, you know, uh, what could change this besides leveling the income is probably thinking of something of an ideal much higher than just economics.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. And I would like to comment a little bit when you said that racial equity maybe doesn't matter when you're born. It can matter because of the treatment, the medical treatment that the mother and the child will get because of race. And that the disparity on the number of maternal deaths in people of color versus, you know, non-people of color is staggering. And it could be another conversation we could have. But then that just shows you that how it encompasses everything, even in birth. Maybe not children, you know, we learn these, but in the treatment, in the care that they get, it matters. So thank you. I think I saw Maddie had her hand up.
Yeah, because hi, I'm Maddie. I live in New York, but I'm Italian. Now, when you were mentioning this historical experience, I was considering that also in Italy it's very difficult for an immigrant not to rent a house, even though they have a good job, they have education. So there is a lot of suspicion that always there. It sometimes doesn't allow the community to grow properly. And at the end, they ended up to be marginalized and not to live sometimes in the center of the city, but sometimes instead they live in Midtown, but because the houses are so old, no one wants to live there because it's a risk. And then this is the way, yeah, and there is for sure a disparity. And then thinking about my experience in the Bronx, I think last year, there was a huge protest in the Bronx because a new highway, want to cross the neighbor and again create this, maybe not redlining, but a real separation between the communities. And the church protests, and there was many meetings to understand better, but having in mind that because of development in a certain sense and new houses, but just for some people was separating the community. And in this area of the Bronx, the population is pretty from South America or Caribbean, and there is just a small community of white people that live pretty isolated from the rest. And this highway, again, will separate African American and South Americans and white more and more.
Thank you. Thank you, Maddie. Anyone else have any comments? Something that came to mind?
Carol has her hand up.
Okay.
I think she's just applauding.
Oh, she will.
No, I actually live in San Francisco in a Black area, and I've moved here 12 years ago, and um, I love where I live. People are, my neighbors. We respect each other. We're very, good to each other, and people have asked me, why do you live there? And I said, because I like where I live, and plus it's also a place that I could afford at the time when I moved here. I grew up in my middle school in Camden, New Jersey, which is also another Black neighborhood, and I never felt any of this racial, gap, because maybe I was young, but I've also felt the respect from the elderlies, the Black elderlies, and they were actually very watchful of where I walk when I'm walking, because I used to walk to school in the morning and the afternoon, and I never felt, insecure. I think it's just, if you expose yourself and accept where you are and respect one another, it should be fine. I know some people are afraid. I don't know why, and maybe I know why, but it's really just respecting one another and loving one another. I just
Thank you.
to put it out there. And yes, we have no groceries. I have a problem with that. I have to go out of my way to buy my groceries.
There you go. Exactly.
Yes. I mean, we have groceries, but there's a turnover. They don't last, unfortunately.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I think there you go, Akina.
Yes, hi, I'm sorry. I need to mute myself. Well, just thinking about my life here in the States, because I'm originally from Mexico. I don't remember much about Mexico because I moved here 50 years ago. And I was so busy, and that's what I tell my children. I don't remember dealing with how do you call this, mental illnesses sometimes that some people have, and probably I have them all. But I said I was too busy trying to put food on the table for my children that I don't remember being sick of anything. I just knew that I needed to feed them. So I didn't. I remember going to live in a very small town, and right now, being in this conversation, I remember that I went to live in the Black African American neighborhood. I never African American and Hispanic people, because those were the more affordable prices. And I don't remember having any problems. My kids could walk to school. Of course, they were little and I took them, but once in a while we could walk without any problems. So that was okay because it was in a small town. I encountered a little bit more problems, probably of discrimination and things like that I can mention in my own church, in the Catholic Church. When I arrived, and there were no masses in Spanish, and there's only two churches, actually until now, two churches, and I was traveling to another town for the Spanish masses, but then I said, why do I need to go when we can have something here? So I started building this Hispanic community inside of the church, like starting with readings and things like that in Spanish, at least. And yes, I was allowed to do that, but I felt from my same Catholic and Hispanic community, I felt this rejections, which was kind of difficult in the time. I was very young, my children were little, but I'm very, how do you call, I don't go home when somebody says something like that. I stay there and okay, you are kind of challenging me, so now I'm going to stay here. So I stay and I helped to build this Hispanic community, Hispanic from Mexico inside of the Hispanic community, Mexican American community in the church, and things like that. Then I came to Dallas, which is a big city, and I will not be able to afford I never bought a house in these 50 years that I live in United States. I never could afford a house. Now I'm in a house, but it's not necessarily mine. It's my daughter. She can pay it, and thank God that she can pay it so that I can be in a house. But for us, it has been also and I'm not surprised about this hate and things like that going on for the, especially for the African American community, because I have feeding myself all the time with movies, with documentals, with everything that comes. I try to see it, and I know that in a movie they can put a little something that is not true, but mostly it's true. And I said, how can people can live without hating when they have been victims of all this hate here in the country? So I'm not surprised because I have seen a lot, and I know people that I can talk to, and but I'm surprised sometimes, and I need to say this: I'm surprised sometimes that white people do not know, for example, about the percentage of incarcerated, which will be a talk for another time, hopefully. My daughter was visiting these jails where they are in to be killed. How do you call for death penalty? Yeah, and she came and told me all this percentage of people, and when I mentioned to somebody white, they tell me they didn't know. So then, yes, I'm surprised and very upset with. I said, you live in this beautiful bubble, and you need to get out of that place. So I'm not surprised. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, that's has been, and we have been surviving a little bit of that. Also, but yeah, as somebody said, we try to love wherever we arrive. We try to change a little bit the environment. And actually, I live in an all white area. Right now, they moved to better places, and now in this more affordable place. But it's still, yeah, we can always try to build this good community. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Joaquina. This is what we're trying to do, right? This is what these conversations are all about.
Yes, thank you.
So we're going to invite Julie to come back for our next section.
Sorry, I'm getting a message to unmute, but I am unmuted. So unclick that. Just want to set up one more idea before we break into the breakout rooms, which is that, you know, of course, when you see inequity, if you're a person who wants to try to resolve it, right, there's a measure that you can take sometimes. So when the issue gets put forward that there is actually financial possibility, it's called reparations, to resolve the wealth gap. It usually comes with these three very specific, it has to have all these three elements or it won't work. So the first of those is acknowledgement, which is the offending party would acknowledge that it has committed a harm and that it has benefited from the execution of that harm. So this could be any context, right? But in the context of reparations for people who are descended from enslaved Africans, it is specifically the offending party would be governments that allowed legally sanctioned, I guess, racism. And obviously the harm would be the people who were harmed by it. The second element of a successful sort of restoration of justice would be redress, which is when the offending party does something, depending on what happened, the something is different, to repair that harm. And then the third element is closure, which is when the offending party and the victimized community would agree that the debt has been paid or the problem has been resolved, and they, you know, move forward from it at that point. So we're going to break into breakout rooms, and we want to offer you the opportunity to choose your own breakout room. And these are the choices. The breakout room number 1 is an opportunity to talk for 15 minutes or so with people about how the spirituality of communion informs a conversation about the wealth gap. I think we have a pretty rich source of information about this. So that's what that one is. And if you're just interested in sort of more information about what kinds of reparations have happened already in history and what kinds of proposals out there to financially resolve a wealth gap, you would pick breakout room number 2. So I think Paul's going to open the breakout rooms, and they will appear at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Either it should say breakout rooms and you're being invited to join one. So you join number 1 if you would like to think about our spiritual response, and number 2 if you want to think about reparations. If you're having trouble, unmute yourself and let Paul know who's going to stay here and help people get into the room.
Okay, I think we're back. And we have just a few minutes remaining. So we'd love people to feel free to share any final thoughts, what you spoke about in the breakout rooms. We also understand if you need to sign off, go ahead. We'll be sending out links for further reading and resources and information in case you want to keep the conversation going, but put your hand up, your virtual hand up, if you have something you'd like to share.
Was really useful. Thank you for all the information I was not aware of. So, and then in our breakout room, there was, one of the question was, it's difficult not to have African descendant, for the reparation. Instead, I was in Alabama at the end of January, and I met a person that the brother of his father-in-law was lynched. So there are still people surviving and suffering still now. And I saw also the tomb of this guy. It was really something being there with the family. So it's not an excuse to say there are not survivors. There are many. So thank you so much really for this. And for sharing also all the resources.
I also want to thank everyone for putting together this session today. It was super informative, I have to say. And there were lots of things we talked about that I knew about redlining, but it was kind of a more, and I'm sure there is even much more than what we shared today, but I felt like what I knew was very superficial compared to what was shared today. So thank you for that. I do have a question. The breakout room sessions, are they going to be part of the recording?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. No, because I was also interested in the other breakout room. So that's why. Okay, but thank you.
So now someone from the other breakout room needs to say a summary.
Well, Hans has his hand up.
I just want to thank you, everyone. It was really powerful. It was also surprising for me. I wasn't aware of this median wealth gap. It's so overwhelming to see it, and it calls to action. And for me, the question is lingering. What can we do to improve the situation, to change the situation? But it was very important. I hope that many can watch the recording, because it's important for us to know, and that helps us to be more aware what is our task, also in the Focolare movement, what we can do to change the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans.
No one's calling on me. I have my hand up.
Oh, Julie.
It was really to say that there are so many positive stories to tell about individual initiatives. And I'm really excited to know about this thing Maddie mentioned about the Bronx. Like, what an opportunity for people to take action in a local place. And, like in sorting through all the myriad of things we could share, beautiful video about a Black man in Maine, how the GI Bill helped him build his dream and his all, so it's not that there aren't also good stories. It's just that the overall big picture, this gap is real. And the attempt to, like obfuscate that by saying all the mitigating good things doesn't take away from the fact that the gap is there and is real, So I think it's important for our souls to share the good stories of all the successes and all the places that are trying to rectify the gap. So I just wanted to say, I'll put some cheerful things in the resources when we send them out too.
It's good.
And thank you, Julie, for mentioning all of that. And I also want to say that the gap, the racial wealth gap, and just the complexity of everything that has gone on may continue or may even get worse in the coming months. So I think it calls for us to be alert for the impact of the changes that are currently going on, and to see how we can make a difference.
Another thing that, and Vivette mentioned this in our breakout groups, ways that we could support each other and support maybe underserved areas. There's a lot of talking about the economy of what's happening now, of boycotting certain industries or certain companies. We have to be mindful on how it does impact maybe communities. So instead, maybe, as Vivette mentioned, mindful spending, where we target, no pun intended, certain communities or organizations to then add to their economic situation. So instead of maybe not buying here being the focus, buying here and supporting these communities could be the focus. I don't know exactly what, in the debt reparation group, what you spoke about, but in one area of reparation, because when people say reparation, people think, well, that's just giving money, free money to people. But there is investing in these communities that are deprived. So money that can be invested in a community to uplift the community, not just handing out checks to people. So how can we think of ways that we can have a handout to uplift, as Pope Francis used to love to say, to pick someone up in these communities that are underserved because of all this systemic racism in the economic field. So that's something that we were kind of discussing as well. Anyone else have any thoughts? If you want to stay on and continue the conversation, feel free to do so. If you have to go, feel free to do so. We're sending out, like we mentioned, more information and resources, and we'll just keep you guys in the loop and continue this conversation. And watch this space. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for participating, and we hope to see you soon in our next venture.
The streets are crowded, the streets are mad, a virus is reckoning across this land. We cannot mask the hate, the truth we face. Symbols must go on, we gotta heal the pain, a daily challenge as we face. I look at the sky, and what do I see? The sunset is down upon me. Will I rise? Will I see another sunrise? Will that freedom come up to me?